You may have noticed that car parking spaces are shrinking, or rather, our cars are getting wider. Fiat had the answer to the car parking spot blues in 1972 when the new Fiat 126 burst on the scene. At just 1.4 metres wide, it's 28 centimetres or almost a foot narrower than the Smart ForTwo and only 36 centimetres longer while accommodating 2 more people. That's not a lot of space to cram 4 people in though, especially in the 1970s with flares and platform shoes. Why did Fiat produce such a tiny car using such old-fashioned parts? And why did this tiny Italian car become one of the most popular family cars in Poland? This is the Fiat 126 story. The Fiat 500 had been a big success. Originally pitched as a smaller Fiat 600, it had become more successful. But the 1950s looks were out of step in the 1970s. To keep selling, it needed an update. Fiat had experimented with modern styling with the Fiat 850 city taxi concept in 1968, with a sliding door to allow better access for rear passengers and a rear window to give more luggage access, especially when the rear seats were folded. This new angular style would be seen in Fiat's breakthrough car, the front-engined hatchback that was the Fiat 127, a design that would be copied by car companies around the world in the 1970s and 80s. But the goal of the Fiat 500 update weren't quite as grand. There were slim profit margins on such an inexpensive car, so Fiat embarked on little more than a styling update using the larger engine from the Fiat 500R. Rear passengers in the old car didn't have much room, so Fiat repackaged the engine, moving the starter to allow the rear seat to move back 10 centimetres. That meant the roof at the back needed to be raised to give rear passengers the headroom they needed. A new styling job also meant the car was better aerodynamically. The 500's 18 horsepower engine was hardly anything to write home about, unless you like fuel economy, that is. Fiat's engineers managed to wring another 5 horsepower out of it while at the same time making it use less fuel. Despite being 55 kilograms heavier, this increased the top speed from 60 miles an hour to 65. The new Fiat 126 launched at the Turin Motor Show in 1972, and excitement of what looked like a brand new car gave way to the realization that this was just an improved Fiat 500 with a new body. It still used 2 levers between the front seats to get it started. The rear boot space was tiny thanks to its engine still being in the back, and like the Fiat 500, the front boot couldn't hold much, although it was a little larger now the fuel tank had been moved under the rear seat. The Fiat 500 was only sold with a canvas sunroof, and the new 126 had that option as well, but it could also be ordered with a full metal roof. It was still a noisy car though, and although it got synchromesh on second, third and fourth, it meant first was still a little rough. Acceleration was so slow that despite the car launching in 1972, it took until 1973 for the car to get up enough speed to shoot this promotional footage. Yes, I jest, but the Fiat 126 took a massive 48 seconds to get to 60 miles an hour. It wasn't the first choice for a getaway car. In fact, if someone stole it, you could probably catch them on foot. This small, simple car now cost 20% more than the old Fiat 500, but it was still a good deal. Fiat had pared a car down to its bare elements to make it affordable. Just one dial, an odometer and some warning lights. Mobility on a budget. The name 126 was part of Fiat's strategy of moving away from naming their cars after the engine size, as they were quickly realizing that didn't make sense when they wanted to slot a larger engine into the car. So the numbers 124 to 133 were used for Fiat's model range between 1966 and 1974. A year after the launch, Fiat started selling the 126 in right-hand drive markets, but Fiat was also doing deals to license the design to other countries. The 500 had been produced in Austria by Steyr Puch, and they also produced the 126 in limited numbers. Fiat had links with car manufacturers in the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, with the Fiat 124 produced in Russia, Zastava in Yugoslavia making the Fiat 600 and 128, and using Fiat 127 parts to make the Yugo. Zastava would make the Fiat 126 as the Zastava 126. but it was Poland that took the Fiat 126 to their hearts. Fiat and the Polish company FSO had been working together since 1965, eventually producing a simplified version of the Fiat 125. But a new Polish president wanted to dramatically increase car ownership and saw the inexpensive Fiat 126 as the ideal car. FSO struck a deal with Fiat to make the car as the Polski Fiat 126p, literally the Polish Fiat 126p, under a new company, FSM. Production began in 1973, initially using parts imported from Italy, but soon Polish factories were churning out perfect copies of the Italian car with parts made in Poland. It was in high demand from Poles hungry to get their first car with the freedom that brought. The demand was so strong, FSM's engineering team worked with the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts to create a prototype of a van version with a capacity of 300 kilograms. Back in Italy, the Fiat 500 had continued production as a more inexpensive alternative to the 126. But with many customers choosing the new 126, production of the Fiat 500 ended in 1975. By 1976, the 126 was selling well, but Fiat knew it would soon need an update. They'd had success with one restyling of the Fiat 500 chassis, so why not another? Fiat continued to push the boundaries of how practical they could make their tiny city car with the Giovanni Michelotti penned Vettura Urbana or city car prototype. Car companies were focused on fuel efficiency, and many small urban cars like these appeared in the mid-70s. The Vettura Urbana had more than a passing resemblance to the Fiat 850 city taxi from 1968, right down to the sliding doors and the 1970s orange paint. It's clear Fiat was trying to tighten the packaging of the steering with a compact front that meant the concept was 26 centimeters shorter than the Fiat 126 it was based on. Fiat showed it off as a potential future Super Mini, but there wasn't enough excitement from the public to turn it into reality. Another prototype shown the same year was the Cavalletta, a mini-moke-style bare-bones Fiat 126, reimagined as a two-seater pickup that could quickly be converted into a family car. I think he might need a bigger barrel though to drain that lake. Moretti would make their own version as the Mini Maxi 126 in 1974. They'd originally produced the Mini Maxi 500 in 1970 based on the Fiat 500, so there was relatively little work needed to update it using the Fiat 126's modified Fiat 500 chassis. Instead of the Vettura Urbana, Fiat customers got the second generation Fiat 126 in 1976. The engine got a tiny 58cc boost, which didn't make it any quicker, but increased the torque. To contain all that new power, the brake diameter was increased. Soundproofing was added to try to improve the noisy cockpit, although it only helped a little. The car got better rack and pinion steering, and the bumpers were now coated with plastic rather than chrome. Inside it was little changed, but there was carpet on the floor rather than rubber, and the front seats got headrests. Fiat produced special black and silver editions. These were still very basic cars though, and Fiat would focus on small features like a new heated rear window. Greece tried to produce a car based on the 126, the DIM that was shown at the 1977 Geneva Motor Show. The original vision was to make their own 400cc engine, but this was abandoned with the company using the 126's 652cc engine. But the economics to produce it never made any sense. Funding never came through, and the company called it quits in 1982 after making only 10 prototypes. By the end of the 1970s, at least outside of Soviet-influenced countries, customers demanded something more modern than what the 126 was offering. Luggage space was tiny, and many 126s would be fitted with a roof rack. The weight of 4 passengers and luggage would make the car even slower. They wanted more luggage space, more people space, something a bit like the Fiat 127 from 8 years earlier. The rear engine layout might have been all the rage in the 1950s, but by the late 1970s the Fiat 126 was the only car produced in Western Europe with the engine in the back. Fiat launched the 126's replacement, the Fiat Panda, in 1980, but the 126 had done just what Fiat wanted. The update of the 500 was done for a minimal amount, and they managed to sell over 1.3 million cars. Not bad going. But that wasn't quite it for the 126, not by a long shot. Fiat had sold the 500 alongside the 126 in 1972, and they did the same thing with the 126 in 1980. Production ended in Italy, but there was still healthy demand for the 126 in Poland, where a planned economy meant the choice between a Polski Fiat 126p or taking a bus. With Poland's economy desperate for foreign currency and their workers paid a pittance, it was possible to keep offering the Fiat 126 in Western Europe and beyond for almost nothing. In fact, in some countries, the Fiat 126 was the cheapest car you could buy. The black and silver special editions gave way to red and brown special editions. There was now a lock on the fuel filler cap, although with a tank that held just 21 litres, there wasn't much to steal. You could even order it with an alarm in the hope that a thief might one day target it. By the 1980s, the Polski Fiat 126p was becoming something of a cultural icon in Poland, being nicknamed Maluch or Little One, or a little less charitably, Kaszlak or Coffer after the engine's distinctive sound. FSM opened a second factory, and by 1981 they produced 1 million cars. It was the little car that could get you to work no matter what the weather, perfect for a quick trip away, but you might have to leave some of your larger pieces of luggage at home. There was even a small lightweight caravan specially designed to be used with it. They even raced it in the Monte Carlo Rally. In Poland, the waiting list was still very long, and once you'd waited in line and received the keys to your new car, you could turn around and sell it for maybe double what you paid for it. Such was the demand for the car, produced in restricted numbers by a one-party government. Like Zastava had done in Yugoslavia, FSM's engineering staff were trying to turn the 126 into a modern car. They produced a front-wheel drive prototype in 1977. By moving the engine to the front, they could turn the car into a hatchback. In 1983, a series of aerodynamic prototypes were produced, again with the help of the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts. The car got an impressive drag of just 0.29, amazing for a small team when Audi was being lauded for its new 100 with a drag of 0.30, although admittedly it was a much bigger car. But FSM was always stymied by a lack of financing, and none of these cars went into production. Confounding all expectations, Fiat's little car continued to sell in Western Europe, so there was a little more money available to keep improving it. A 1985 update took some ignition and valve timing improvements from the Polish car to improve fuel efficiency. Rather than doing a dance to start the car with the two levers on the floor, drivers could now simply turn a key like everyone else. There was a rear fog lamp, hazard warning lights and bigger bumpers. The old heater felt like a small hamster was breathing on your legs, but the new heater and ventilation system had much more power. The rear seat folded down to make lugging your stuff easier, and rear passengers got their own seat belts. It got a new steering wheel and more comprehensive dashboard with warning lights and a real fuel gauge for the first time. No longer did Fiat 126 owners have to guess when the warning light would illuminate to tell you you were almost out of fuel. Much of this was likely done to keep the car legal, but it also made it easier to drive. The Fiat 126 was still true to the goal of when it launched, mobility on a budget. Another update came in 1987 as the Fiat 126 bis. The car's old-fashioned engine was air-cooled, and changes were made to both increase the capacity to 704 cc's, but also turn it into a more modern water-cooled engine. Acceleration improved, with a top speed now of 72 miles an hour, while also getting better fuel economy. The update also allowed the car to run on unleaded fuel. It was 10 kilograms lighter, being made of aluminium rather than cast iron. The engine was turned horizontally, giving more luggage space and allowing FSM to give the car a hatchback for the first time. The 126 was practical, but it still had its issues. The 35 amp-hour battery and additional 1985 electronics drew more power than the undersized alternator could produce. That meant drivers who didn't use their 126 very often would need a jump start on a regular basis. The new 126 bis was better, but it was outclassed by many of its rivals, so continued to be sold in the discount section of the car showroom. Its main advantage was the low price, and soon more countries got a taste of bargain price motoring. Naturally, Poland exported to other Eastern Bloc countries, and it would be exported to other communist countries such as Cuba and China. But the 126 also showed up in unexpected places like Australia from 1989, billed as today's most affordable new car. Despite the update, the 126 was still a very outdated car, but it took not one, but two cars to replace it. The Fiat Panda continued to be sold, but Fiat introduced a new car almost the same size, the Fiat Cinquecento, or 500 in Italian, meant to be something of a continuation of the 1950s Fiat 500, and it would be produced in FSM's Polish factories. Sales of the 126 ended in Western Europe, but it was still selling well in Poland and other Eastern Bloc countries that had recently been liberated from communist oppression. They were taking their first faltering steps into democracy and a market-based economy, and were still in desperate need of reasonably priced transportation. FSM was privatized and was purchased by Fiat. Once again, Fiat was responsible for manufacturing the 126. FSM hadn't quite finished customizing the 126 though. After experimenting with an add-on pod on the back in the 1970s, they produced an open-top version, the Bosmal 126 Cabriolet. A German company called Pop made their own version of an open-top, but both versions were produced in very limited numbers. By 1993, 3 million 126s had been produced in Poland, and the 126 was updated with some parts from the Polish-produced Fiat Cinquecento, such as electronic fuel injection and a catalytic converter. It was all to help keep the 126 relevant, yet cost-effective enough to be something Eastern European countries could buy. But the standard of living in those countries was rising, and customers could start affording more modern cars like the Fiat Cinquecento. Sales of the 126 continued, but they were slowing. The car, renamed with its Polish nickname, the Maluch, or Little One, was now possibly the only rear-engine car still produced in Europe. It had been in production for so long that it witnessed the birth of a next-generation rear-engined car, the Smart City Coupe, a car that would be renamed the Smart ForTwo. Production of the plucky 126 finally ended in 2000 after 28 years, with the 126 Maluch Happy End Special Edition, either in red or yellow. Poland was a very different country since the Fiat 126 started production. They'd gone from a planned communist economy to a free market and a much higher standard of living. The FSM factories, now renamed Fiat Auto Poland, were churning out modern Fiats like the new Fiat Seicento, and after that Fiat's new Super Mini, styled on the car the 126 replaced, the new Fiat 500. Fiat would be joined by Volkswagen, Isuzu and Toyota as car manufacturers found hard-working Polish workers could produce quality cars. The Fiat 500 shape has been revived, but not the squarer Fiat 126. But the 126 has a cuteness all of its own, so might we see a modern-day version? Well, in 2020, Marday Studios imagined what a modern Fiat 126 might look like as the 126 Vision. So far, Fiat hasn't taken the bait to cash in on Polish and Italian nostalgia. Why should they, when the Fiat 500 is selling so well? With such basic mechanics, the 126 has been a popular car to modify with motorcycle engines or even as an EV, but its propensity to rust and the cheap, almost disposable nature of the car has meant many have disappeared from our roads. The 1950s Fiat 500 is remembered as a great car, and it is, selling almost 3.9 million of them. But the Fiat 126 more than outsold it, with almost 4.7 million cars providing transportation to people around the world. But there's far more nostalgia for the cute-looking 500. The Fiat 126 had its problems, but for many families it was their first taste of automotive freedom, mobility on a budget. There's a link to the usual optional extra video where I talk a little more about the Fiat 126 and maybe share some of my opinions about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.